He's considered one of the founders of Stoicism. He is Zeno of Citium. He's actually a little bit later and he's usually overshadowed by his teacher, but he's very important for the development of Stoicism. So let's have a look at the life of Hermagoras. Hermagoras was born in the city of Amphipolis, which was on the border between the region of Macedonia and Thrace. It's near the modern Turkish city of Dep, and we don't know exactly when he was born, but it's believed to be around 270 BC or somewhere around there, and he died sometime after 225 BC. That's what we can gather from the letters of the Roman philosopher Pliny the Younger. So Hermagoras would have been about 40 years old when he went to Athens and met the Stoics, and about 65 when he came to Rome. But we don't know exactly when he died. We only know that it's after this letter of Pliny. So that means it could have been any year after 225 BC. Like many of the ancient philosophers, we don't know much about his life. The earliest reference we have is Polybius writing about him in his General History, where he says that Hermagoras was a pupil of the Stoic philosopher Perseus of Citium, who was also a pupil of Zeno. But Hermagoras wasn't just a passive student of Perseus. He was actually an active member of the community of Stoics in Athens, like Zeno before him. And he continued to teach in the academy in Athens. And although he had studied with Perseus and shared many of his ideas, he did develop some of his own views. The main area in which he diverged from the mainstream Stoics is in his views about virtue. The Stoics generally held that the chief good was living in accordance with nature. You know that from Marcus Aurelius, right? He says, the purpose of life is to live according to nature. But Hermagoras turned this around. He said the chief good is nature, or at least the appearance of living according to nature. The idea here is that if you're doing what's right and being virtuous, then it doesn't matter what the underlying causes are. And this is quite different from the Stoics, because the Stoics thought that you needed to examine your thoughts and your motivations and make sure they were pure. Otherwise, you're not living virtuously. But Hermagoras says, no, what matters is the outward appearance of your actions. As long as you seem to be virtuous, then you are virtuous. And it doesn't really matter what your motivations are. We get this from Diogenes Laertius, who is our primary source for her. He wrote a biography of Hermagoras, unfortunately now lost, but luckily Diogenes provides us with some of its content. So we know what Hermagoras thought. He also says that Hermagoras taught that the wise person has no superior. He's absolutely free. And we also learn that he wrote a book called On the Chief Good, where he develops these ideas further. There's another story about him and Diogenes, which shows how far his ideas diverged from the mainstream Stoics. One day, while Hermagoras was walking through the agora in Athens, someone ran up to him and shouted, "Hey, Hermagoras," and he stopped and asked, "What's up?" And the guy shouts, "Why do you impede my progress?" And Hermagoras replied, "I didn't do anything." And he said, "Yes, you did. You stood still." So Hermagoras decided to stand still again, and he asked, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And the man said, "Let me pass." And Hermagoras said, "No, why should I?" And he started to argue with him. And Hermagoras says, "Look, man, I'm engaged in a philosophical discussion right now." And the guy said, "Oh yeah, well, so am I." And Hermagoras, "What do you mean?" And the other guy said, "I'm looking for someone to discuss philosophy with. I'm looking for someone better than myself, and I think you are that person. So stand still and let me talk to you." So Hermagoras stood still and discussed philosophy with him for a long time. And then, when they finally parted ways, Hermagoras said to himself, "Man, I must never do that again, standing still when someone tells me to." But he did notice that that other guy had improved through their discussion and thought to himself, but perhaps it's worth it. This story is interesting. It gives us an insight into Hermagoras' view on things. He isn't dogmatic. He's open to discussing his ideas with anyone, and he sees the value of dialogue and debate. He's willing to compromise his own position for the sake of improving someone else's. This is, I think, a very Stoic thing to do. It's also something Epictetus would have done. He wanted to improve people's lives. He wanted to help them. And sometimes you need to meet them where they are, so to speak. So I think this is very telling about Hermagoras' character and about his teaching. This brings me to another point that I want to make. Sometimes people accuse Epictetus of making Stoicism more of a superficial religion rather than a philosophy. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think that's a mistake. Epictetus didn't invent Stoicism. He was a Stoic, but he didn't invent it. Zeno did. And then Cleanthes and then Chrysippus built it up, and Hermagoras was also a Stoic, but he wasn't even from Athens. It was from a small town on the border of Macedonia, but he traveled to Athens. He probably visited the academy. He was interested in politics. He wanted to make something of himself, and Stoicism provided the framework for that. He then took some of those ideas, developed them, made them his own, and I think this was a strength of Stoicism, not a weakness. It was a philosophy that was able to absorb people from all walks of life, wherever they came from, whatever their background was, and if they were virtuous, and they wanted to learn and improve themselves, then Stoicism could provide them with a system for that. And Hermagoras was one of the great benefits of this. His ideas were a little bit different from the mainstream Stoics. He was happy to discuss his ideas, he was happy to debate them, and he was happy to adjust them if need be. When Hermagoras was in Rome, he became friends with a very important man named Gaius Fannius Syrus. He was a wealthy Roman senator who would become consul in 138 BC, and he was so enamored with Hermagoras' ideas that he commissioned him to write a manual of Stoic philosophy. Unfortunately, this work is also lost, but Diogenes gives us the outline of it. First, Hermagoras talks about the nature of the Stoics and their goals. Then he talks about the various obstacles that prevent people from living virtuously, such as wealth and power and reputation. And then he talks about the actual rules of conduct for a Stoic. Things like not judging others, not being attached to external things, and so on. And then he ends with some advice on how to deal with death, how to think about it properly, how to overcome our fear of death. I think this outline shows the breadth of Stoic philosophy. It touches on almost everything: the nature of happiness, the obstacles that prevent us from being happy, and then the practical steps we need to take to actually achieve that goal. This is what makes Stoicism so useful, so practical, and why it's still relevant today. Hermagoras' handbook was very influential. Not only did it inspire Pliny the Younger to become a Stoic, but Cicero read it and based his own handbook of Stoic philosophy on it. So, even though Hermagoras may be a lesser-known figure in the history of Stoicism, his influence was far-reaching. He helped spread Stoicism throughout the Roman world, and he inspired some of the greatest Stoics of the classical period. If you want to learn more about Stoicism, check out the links in the description. Don't forget to subscribe for new videos every week. Thanks for watching.